From News 8, this is a 24-hour update.
Good morning. An electrical fire forced a United Airlines passenger plane to make an emergency landing at Kent County International Airport. Flight 316 from Chicago to Manchester, New Hampshire, carrying 70 passengers, made a hasty landing around 3:30 yesterday afternoon. Authorities blame the incident on a small fire from a malfunctioning coffee maker. No one was injured. More news in an hour.
Stay tuned for the next 24-hour update from News 8. On the next Health Matters.
And having to go out and play a final the next day and losing very badly. I had trouble walking.
For years, tennis champion Billie Jean King kept her pain a secret. Find out why. Then come off the courts and into the space age. Watch as a computer draws up plans to replace the bone that nature wore away. All on the next Health Matters, your complete source of medical news and health information.
I'm Jennifer Moss. Be sure to tune into Health Matters today at 11:30 on TV8.
Hello again, and welcome to Meet the Press. Today, moving a nation, how to get there from here. Our guest is Samuel Skinner, Secretary of Transportation.
From NBC News, this is Meet the Press with Garrick Utley.
For anyone who drives in a car or a truck, takes a bus, a subway or train, flies in a plane, rides a bicycle, or tries to walk across a busy street, this program is for you. Transportation touches everyone. This Memorial Day weekend announces the beginning of summer, a time when travel should be fun, not an ordeal, and new legislation which will affect how we travel is before Congress these days. What should have priority, though? Money for more highways or for mass transportation? The individual's car or a public bus or commuter train? Questions of how we travel cut to the heart of our national identity. And that's why we're talking today with Samuel Skinner, the Secretary of Transportation. And joining me at the desk are David Broder of the Washington Post and our Mr. Secretary. Thanks for coming in on this holiday weekend. It's been said that in life the journey is more important than the destination, and yet anyone who gets stuck in a traffic jam or an overcrowded airport would probably disagree with that. They just want to get there. Now, when you look at our transportation system today, how satisfied are you with it?
Well, I'm not satisfied. I think it's a good system, but it's certainly not the best in the world, and we certainly have a long way to go to improve it. That's why we have probably the most comprehensive bill that has been put forth since the interstate highway system was developed in 1955 before the Congress. We've got to invest more in transportation, and we're attempting to do that. And that's my mandate from the President. All
right, this legislation covers the next 5 years, $105 billion approximately is being proposed. The question is, where does it go? The administration wants to put the greatest emphasis on highways. An alternative bill, bipartisan bill in Congress, is talking about giving more freedom, allowing states to use more for mass transportation. And there are really two camps arguing this issue. Why do you insist on highways getting priority?
Well, first of all, it's a balanced program. We think that the biggest problem facing our nation is congestion. And congestion is primarily on the highways of this country. To give you a feel for it, if we were to double the number of people that ride mass transit every day, if we were able to do that, we would reduce consumption of gasoline by just 2%. Most of the congestion that occurs is on the highways of this country. There is no mass transit alternative in these areas, and we've got to do something about reducing congestion if we're going to increase our productivity. The waste and the loss of time on the highways is what's really hurting our productivity, and that's why we've got a balanced program, but heavy emphasis on highways and surface transportation.
David.
There's a kind of a philosophical question that's involved here, not just dollars. The bipartisan bill that Garrick referred to, that Senator Moynihan is the lead sponsor, give about half the money to the states and say, you know your situation best, you decide how to spend it. I thought that was the philosophy of the Bush administration, but you're threatening to have the president recommend a presidential veto of that bill. How come?
Well, first of all, the bill that we presented, the president's bill, had a lot of flexibility in it. It also called for a coordinating process. Taking less responsibility here in Washington, giving more responsibility to state and local government, but at the same time having a coordination function at the national level so that we can have really a system, the national highway system, that will really be integrated from state to state. And it's that balance that we're discussing with the Congress. And I think most people understand the need to give states more flexibility, David, but at the same time, we want a national coordinated process or a blueprint as you move into Canada. You know, who is going to decide what the arteries are going to be into Canada and what the resources are going to be? The federal government ought to have a role. States won't do that on an individual basis. They won't cooperate enough to have that national coordination. So that's the only discussion. Both bills are very flexible.
That sounds like an elegant way of saying Skinner knows best. Why don't you trust the states to make the transportation decisions? Most of this money is not going to be spent on roads connecting U.S. to Canada. Most of it's going to be spent within our own borders. Why can't the states make those decisions?
Well, we do trust the states to make those decisions, David. We just can't make sure, we have to make sure that in making those decisions, they take into consideration the needs of adjoining states, that state and local governments work together, not only on a local basis, but on a regional basis.
Sounds sort of like trust but verify.
Well, that's a pretty good analogy. Yes, I'd say that's a good analogy.
Secretary Skinner, you say there is no alternative to highway transportation, that alternate means don't exist. Isn't it true that one of the reasons there's no alternative is that the federal government, ever since the Interstate Highway Act was passed, has put all its money into highways, and that those highways have acted like magnets, drawing passengers away from other methods?
Well, I think it's a matter of planning. First of all, we spend about $3 billion plus on mass transit every year. That's a substantial commitment. We're calling for major commitment within the bill. What we're asking is that there be a proper balance. State and local governments have the responsibilities for deciding whether it should be mass transit, whether it should be high occupancy vehicle lanes, whether it should be single passenger vehicle lanes. And we rely on the states to make that decision. On the other hand, in many cases, the states have decided that in the suburban areas and in the rural areas where mass transit just isn't justified on a cost basis, they've got to move forward with surface transportation and highways. And don't forget, all of this money is coming from highway users. So this is not a matter of general revenue. This is highway user funding that's coming into the trust fund and then back out again. And right now we're diverting a good portion of that to mass transit.
What about investment in rail service? This is the 20th anniversary of Amtrak. Everybody, notably including most Republican administrations since its creation, has said it won't work. It's a waste of taxpayers' money. It was one of the things that was always on the Republican hit list in the Reagan administration. It's so successful at this point that it doesn't have enough equipment to carry the people who would like to ride it. Why not invest in success much more heavily than we're doing?
Well, we have changed that trend. As you know, in the Bush administration, we have more money for capital for intercity rail than we've ever had before. Amtrak is getting good support from the administration. We have a substantial amount of money in the president's budget, which is the first time in 8 years we've done that.
The man who runs it says he doesn't have enough locomotives.
Well, that's why the Bush administration, working with the Congress, has put $150 million aside for new equipment, including locomotives, and they're actually ordering new locomotives today. You're right, he doesn't have enough. They're moving towards self-sufficiency, and we're going to help them move towards self-sufficiency. But we want this system to be self-sufficient before the turn of the century.
So, Secretary, let's move from sort of grand strategy and planning to a specific situation that anyone who drives on the highway runs into. You're going down that interstate or big highway, and you see those big semi-trailer trucks coming. Maximum weight now is about 40 tons. The trucking industry wants that raised to 60 tons or more so they can have these really behemoth triple trailer units going across this country. Now, is that the kind of thing that you believe belongs on American highways, trucks of this size?
Well, first of all, the president's bill does not touch that issue.
I know, but it's being raised and you're going to be involved in this.
Yes, and we will be involved at the appropriate time. We've taken no position on it at this time. We don't think it's appropriate to involve that safety issue in a highway and mass transit reauthorization bill for surface transportation. That ought to be dealt with separately. We're going to deal with it separately, but not as part of the surface transportation bill.
But don't you believe that there is a limit of what you can or should put on the highways? I mean, people are driving around in their cars and suddenly these triple trailers are coming down at them.
Well, there's no question that if in fact safety is involved and that lives are endangered by the size of a truck or the speed of a truck, it's an issue that ought to be dealt with. Speeding is a very major problem, not just with trucks, with automobiles as well. And we've got to have good, strong enforcement of those rules and regulations. If we do that, we can do a lot to increase safety on the highways of this country.
David?
Let me bring you back to the one other aspect of the highway bill. You did threaten or recommend a veto. The president, we all saw on television, saying, this is one of my two highest priorities. Are you serious about that he might veto this bill if it doesn't come to him in exactly the form that you recommended?
Well, not exactly the form we've recommended, no. A form that meets some of his criteria, yes. It's too important an issue. This is the most comprehensive, innovative bill since the interstate highway system was passed, and we've got to make sure we get a good bill. And we've got to look long range, David, as you and I have talked about before. You can't have short range vision. There's too much of that in this town.
You made the point that you need national planning and coordination for a transportation system. But the bill that you recommended, the President recommended, calls for the federal government actually to reduce the share of the overall transportation bill that it would pay. Why? How do you reconcile that inconsistency?
Well, first of all, every state in the nation would get more money under this bill in the next 5 years than they have the last 5. So there's more federal money. Number two, we believe that we get better projects and better management of projects if the state and local governments have a vested interest. It's not free money from Washington. It is money that you've got to invest with us in, and we can also use that for leverage. And everybody knows who's been in state government, and I've heard it said the other day by a former governor who now sits in the Congress, that if in fact it's free money from Washington, you don't pay the same amount of attention to it as if you have to come up with your own financial investment.
You travel the country and you know what the fiscal problems are that the states are facing. How do you really think that the states are going to increase the amount of money that they put into transportation?
Well, first of all, they can do it if they want. California just did it last year, and they're doing an awful lot with state and local money in California. Number two, we've got to look long range. This is a short range problem that the states have. And if we make short range decisions instead of long range decisions, we're going to really be penny wise and pound foolish. And we're not going to allow that to happen. So we've just got to educate the American people that this in the long run is the right thing to do, and then give the states some relief for the first couple of years under the program, and we do that in the legislation.
Mr. Skinner, a very short question. You're saying that you're going to increase the number of people who wear seat belts, perhaps the single most important thing for public safety on the highways, from roughly 50% now to roughly 75% in 1992. That's about a year from now. How do you propose to do that?
Well, the goal is actually 70%, Johnny. If we can get to 75%, I'd be obviously delighted.
But how are you going to get to 70?
Well, number one, we're going to enforce the laws that exist. That's an important part of it. It's been proven in states like Texas and in countries like Canada.
So people be picked up when they're driving in their cars without seat belts on?
If, in fact, it's the law that you wear your seat belt, we're going to ask law enforcement to enforce that law. That's what happened in Canada. That's what happened in Europe. They're up to almost 80 to 90% in some of those countries because of stronger enforcement and better education. And, you know, the answer is that we lose 44,000 lives a year on the highways of this country, and we can really make a dent into that loss of lives if we get people to wear belts.
I think, Mr. Secretary, a lot of people would be surprised that only half of people driving actually use seat belts these days. We're going to come back with more topics, more questions, the airlines, other transportation problems of the future in just one moment. We'll be right back.
Meet the Press is sponsored by the Archer Daniels Midland Company. ADM, supermarket to the world.
Now, yesterday we were talking about food. Today we're going to talk about where it comes from. Does anybody know? Jill?
It comes from the grocery store.
Well, yes, but before that, anybody else? Andy?
Food comes from the farmers who grow it, and all the other people who help turn it into the food that we eat every day.
American agriculture is something we can all be proud of. It's not only America's biggest industry, it's the most productive system of its kind in history.
That's very good. How do you know so much about food?
Well, my dad's a great teacher. Hey, Tammy! Hey, Dad!
Considering how abundant food is in this country, it's easy to see why some people take it for granted. Fortunately, a lot of other people don't. ADM, supermarket to the world.
We're back now. David Broder, Johnny Apple, and I are talking to Transportation Secretary Samuel Skinner. Mr. Skinner, let's go from the highways to the airways, so to speak. Airline travel, it's getting busier than ever. Deregulations in effect. And a lot of people are still complaining about what they have to pay. For example, if you're going from Washington to Houston these days, pay full fare, it's $9.58. If you purchase it 7 days in advance, stay over Saturday night, fill a lot of other requirements, it's only $2.78. Don't you think this complexity has really gotten a bit out of hand?
Well, first of all, 90% of the people that flew last month in this country flew on discount fares. So more people are getting the $298 fare than the $900 fare. Obviously, the airline industry is going through a transformation. We're going to have fewer airlines than we've had in the past. On the other hand, they'll be bigger, they'll be stronger, and they'll be more competitive. And as these airlines get more competitive, the price opportunities like the $298 fare will become available, if, in fact, the airlines can learn to control their costs.
All right, let's address that topic specifically. Pan Am, flag carrier, goes back decades. Do you think Pan Am's going to survive?
Well, I'm not overly optimistic from what I saw in the papers over the weekend. I think Pan Am doesn't have the domestic route structure to feed its international routes. Other airlines now have those international route structures, so Pan Am is not the exclusive carrier or one of two exclusive carriers, and they have they're having a tough time making the transformation. Hopefully that organization will be picked up in part or in whole by another airline and made part of their network.
Well, if you're not very hopeful about Pan Am's future as a company itself, what about TWA?
I'm more optimistic about TWA. Number one, they have a domestic network that's greater than Pan Am's. Number two, they have a good international network, and what is left of the international network, including service to London, is still a very good service. So I think that all in all, TWA has a very good chance of surviving. And I'm not saying that Pan Am doesn't. I'm just saying it's not quite as good as TWA's.
Johnny.
Mr. Skinner, suppose Pan Am and TWA both go under. Would you be worried, frenzied, bothered? What would you feel?
Well, of course I'd be bothered anytime we lose an airline. I'm bothered. I'm bothered because of that airline and the people that it employs. But on the other hand, I recognize that neither one of those airlines is so dominant in the industry that it would have a significant impact that the other airlines would pick it up. And I might also add that for 25 years, TWA and Pan Am have been in financial trouble. They appealed to the CAB for emergency loans 25 years ago before deregulation. So,
how many airlines, how few airlines can we afford to have in the United States?
Well, it all depends how competitive they are. I think we'll have probably 7. I think we could go as low as 4 and have a very competitive system, but I don't think we'll go to that
3,
level.
we couldn't have a competitive system?
We could have a competitive system with 3. I don't think we'll have 3. I think we'll have probably close to 7 with both domestic and international routes. Most of the major carriers will survive in some form and be very competitive.
Well, now the Airline Passengers Association, excuse me for interrupting you.
That's all right.
Which represents 100,000 or something like that, people who fly all the time, those poor souls who fly for a living, says that what you're doing is encouraging an oligopoly and that there's more theoretical than actual competition because of the dominance of one airline or another in X or Y hub. That is to say, if you're flying to Minneapolis, Northwest is going to be your airline. If you live in Minneapolis, you're going to fly them all the time. If you live in Kansas City, you're going to spend a lot of your life on TWA and not have real competition. What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, the big airlines do compete against each other. The 2 biggest competitors in the airline industry today are United and American, and they go toe-to-toe in an awful lot of places in this country. And
but
they're always looking...
Not if you live in Dallas.
Well, in Dallas, that has happened to be. In Chicago, they are very competitive, which is the biggest market. Well, that's the biggest market. In Washington, they're very competitive.
No.
Well, sure, they're very competitive.
United is dominant in Washington as compared.
Well, the New York, they're dominant. Neither party is dominant. There's a number of places where American and United are very competitive. They're both very competitive in Europe, in London.
So we're not getting an oligopoly here.
Well, we're getting fewer airlines. We're getting more competitive airlines. We're getting larger structures, and we're getting airlines that I think will compete both domestically and internationally, and that's what it's going to take to survive as a big major carrier.
David.
In your speeches, you put a lot of the blame for the problems of the airlines on their labor costs. What do you think an airline pilot really ought to be paid? Do you have a number in your head?
Well, I really do, as I bring home the point that if we can't control the costs at airlines generally, we're not going to be able to price that product competitively. The market ought to determine what an airline pilot makes. The market ought to determine. The collective bargaining process ought to determine. I might add, it also ought to apply to executive salaries and things like that. So it's not just pilots.
But the market has determined. The collective bargaining process has set these wages, and yet you keep saying these wages are out of line. What do you think they ought to be?
Well, What do I think they ought to be? I mean, the disparity between the airlines is in one case, a senior captain with experience is making $8,000, and another airline for the same job he's making $14,000. The market is a month, $14,000 a month. Between 8 and 14 is a big disparity. Is that market doing the same job for this, the same type of equipment, flying the same number of hours and the same rate of productivity? One gets 8,000 and one gets 14. Is that the free market? I don't think so.
Let's step back from what's happening today, Mr. Secretary, look to the future. I know you've devoted some thought to where we're going to be in transportation of the highways, cars in the early part of the next century. Computer, new technologies. How will we be driving? How will we be moving?
Well, I do think computer technology offers probably the biggest single potential for increasing our nation's productivity. If, in fact, we can use computers to determine the congestion levels on the highways of this country, for example, we can then, in our automobile or in our truck, make informed decisions as to which alternative route to take based upon the congestion levels. And if we can level out the usage of highways in this country, we can really get the load off of 66 here in Virginia, get it over to Route 50, or get it up north on 495, and therefore, in doing that, we'll put an even load on the system, and there's a great deal of potential there. So computers can do that. Global positioning satellites can do that as well.
All right, this sounds wonderful. I mean, our car, the computer, those global satellites over the interstates across this country, the Montavani's on the radio, the air conditioning is blowing. But how far away are we from this in practical terms, beyond the prototypes of the average motorist?
Well, I think by the turn of the century, we'll have it available as a regular process. We have experimental projects going on in Chicago and Orlando and Los Angeles. We continue to invest hundreds of millions of dollars into this technology, and I think before too long you'll see it available in major metropolitan areas where the congestion is the worst.
What is it going to cost, price tag, for the average motorist who goes to work each day?
Several $100s on the purchase of an automobile ought to be able to do it.
To put that equipment in?
To put that equipment in. In many cases, like Chicago, we have sensors on the highways right now. So therefore, we can use some of the existing technology on the highways. Eventually, once the positioning satellites are in place, any receiver can read those satellites.
Sounds great. And once that technology is in place in the cars, the journey may be more interesting than the destination. Mr. Secretary, thanks for being with us this morning. In just a moment, David Broder, Johnny Apple, and I will be back with some personal observations.
Imagine your refrigerator with bigger door shelves for bigger bottles, with leftovers left in quick-serve trays for leftover space, more space, nearly 27 cubic feet, and a door in the door for things you use more. Imagine GE's Space Center 27.
But I could not believe it when I ate it. It was just, they're just absolutely wonderful.
I've learned to like them quite a bit. We take them home and eat them pretty regularly.
They were really delicious. I like them.
They're just good.
Oh, they'd get a 10 for sure.
They're talking about it in the Midwest.
It's quick. I know it's nutritious. It's going to be good for me.
And Bob has a high cholesterol problem, so they really solve a lot of problems for our whole family.
And soon it may be on the lips of people everywhere.
If he says it's good, it is really good.
Yeah, I like them.
It's the Midland Harvest brand Harvest Burger, an all-vegetable patty from the Archer Daniels Midland Company. Harvest burgers are low in fat, low in calories, free of cholesterol, and contain dietary fiber. Qualities that are in growing demand by today's health-conscious consumers. And what are people saying about the taste? We couldn't have said it better ourselves. ADM, supermarket to the world.
At GE, we just had an idea that could help eliminate pollution from the atmosphere. An idea that could save power plants 3 million tons of coal a year and 1 million barrels of oil. Introducing GE's Energy Choice lights. If we all changed to these lights, we'd save our resources, and you'd save enough on your electric bill to all but pay for the bulbs. New GE Energy Choice. No wonder the light bulb is the symbol for a brilliant idea.
And we're back now this morning to meet the press. David and Johnny, listening to the Secretary and talking about transportation brings our focus really back to domestic problems. We're all aware of what's happening with bridges. What, 40% of them are supposed to be inadequate in the nation these days. And yet, what does this tell you about the President's commitment to the famous domestic agenda, Johnny?
Well,
I thought David's point, first of all, that the opposition has taken the Republican clothes on this is quite sound. It is amazing to hear a Bush administration, a Republican administration, say that it wants to make the decisions in Washington. For a long time, going back to profit sharing, revenue sharing under Richard Nixon, the opposite has been the big argument of the Republicans. Second, it says to me that they're not really ready to do imaginative things in terms of shifting any of the burden off the highways. I, for one, believe that the highways are crowded basically because we've discouraged other forms of transportation.
But you're talking about changing human nature here, getting the American individual out of his or her automobile, and it may sound like a great idea to solve urban congestion.
It wasn't human nature before Henry Ford came along, so I doubt that it's
There's
really
an interesting thing that was demonstrated here today. President Bush, though his own interest lies overseas primarily, has got able and energetic people like your guest in the domestic side of the cabinet. What he doesn't have at this point, I think, is any kind of a consistent philosophy of who ought to be doing what at home, who ought to be making the decisions, and who ought to be paying for it.
Not just in transportation, but
the biggest problem is transportation, schools, all of these areas. Who's going to pay the bill?
That always is the question, isn't it? David and Johnny, thanks very much for being here today. Well, finally, as we look at our world, post-Cold War, post-Gulf War world, it is clear that one of the changes we face these days can be summed up in the question, what is news? Journalism. Like it or not, the news agenda is being revised. No editor or producer in television is doing it. Events are simply redefining what is of interest and importance. A few weeks ago, if we talked about bridges and roads, it was about smart bombs blowing up bridges and roads in Iraq. This morning, we've talked with the Secretary of Transportation about building them. A growing number of Americans who specialize in international affairs are saying that this nation's #1 priority today is not overseas, but it is rather here solving our domestic problems, and it is clear that is where much of our journalistic focus is going to be in the future. Abroad, too, though, the agenda is changing. Look at just the events this past week. India, the world's largest democracy, had just about fallen off the journalistic map until the tragedy of Rajiv Gandhi's assassination brought it back to the front page on our television screens, and India and its uncertain future is likely to be a continuing story for some time. Here in Washington, Congress gives the green light to negotiate a free trade pact with Mexico, which will profoundly alter much of our perception of the world. Journalists like to think that we help set a nation's agenda. Truth be told, we're more a weather vane than a catalyst, and the proverbial winds of change are now blowing us all, purveyors and consumers of news, in new directions. I'm Garrick Utley. You can see the news tonight on NBC Nightly News, and join us again next week for Sunday Today and Meet the Press.